Last time we spoke about the fall of Guinea. By late July of 1944, the Japanese at Guinea in northern Burma were facing severe challenges. Despite holding out through a long siege, they were cut off from supplies and suffering heavy casualties. A leadership conflict between Colonel Maruyama and General Miaki further complicated things. Maruyama defended the city intensely, while Miaki aimed to deny Allied access to strategic roads. With depleted forces, including wounded troops trying to escape via the erupted river, the Japanese defenses were weakened. Allied forces reinforced and ready made significant gains, shrinking Japanese-held areas. On August 1st, Miaki agreed to withdraw, and the remaining Japanese began escaping across the river. The Allies launched a final attack, securing Guinea on August 3rd. The 10-week-long siege resulted in substantial casualties for both sides. The victory allowed the Allies to improve logistical routes and marked a critical point in the Burma campaign. This episode is the Battle of the Dromore River. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we start, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over there, I just released a long-form documentary on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Alongside this, I just started a new podcast series on the North African campaign during World War II. And hey, if you have a chance, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what we'll tackle next. The last episode voted upon was about Unit 731, and trust me, that podcast is a grisly horror show. But hey, if you're interested in that, go check it out. Last time we were seeing some action kick up around the Driniumor River. While the Japanese offensive had initially been successful, General Hall's forces managed to halt the enemy's advance and reform their line by July the 15th, despite a 1,500-yard gap in the center. The Japanese were aware of this weakness in the American lines and they exploited it, especially during the night. However, Colonel Starr's 3rd Battalion patrolled this area and occasionally engaged the enemy, killing 135 Japanese on the night of July the 14th. Despite this, General Cunningham claimed that his South Force had extended its lines nearly 1,000 yards beyond its assigned sector, without encountering any elements of the 124th Regiment. Consequently, on July the 15th, Starr concluded that his regiment had not advanced as far south as previously reported, and ordered his units to adjust their line southwards to extend their defensives up to the Driniumor towards Cunningham's Troop E. The following morning, Starr's 3rd Battalion began moving south to close the gap. As they reached the area by nightfall, Troop E was attacked by 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 239th Regiment. While the cavalrymen sought cover, Starr's 3rd Battalion was also attacked by Colonel Nara's 3rd Battalion, which had turned south after its defeat at Pop Villages. This split the American forces in two, with companies L and M pushing south through the increasing opposition to reach the South Force lines, while companies I and K dug in for the night in their current positions. Despite the intense fighting, several Japanese were killed and the gap was reduced to 500 yards. In the course of the day's fighting, the coastal attack force had lost all of its artillery and had suffered heavy casualties. Additional losses were sustained on succeeding days, but Major Hoshino and his men were not completely removed as an irritant until the night of July the 16th. During that night, remnants of the coastal attack force, about 35 men strong, attacked the North Force and 124th Infantry command posts installations at Anamo. At around 11 o'clock, the group charged out of the jungle southwest of the Anamo perimeter. Repulsed by machine gun fire, the enemy temporarily disappeared, only to reappear at 3 o'clock on the 17th of July, moving west against Anamo along the beach. Machine gun fire from the American positions broke up this second attack, but about 10 minutes later, the Japanese tried again, this time moving on Anamo from the north by wading in from the sea. Once ashore, Major Hoshino's men broke up into small groups, attempting to destroy mechanized equipment, automatic weapons positions, and communication installations. The coastal attack force remnants had apparently scouted well, for they were reported to have moved purposely towards the most important installations, and they easily found their way about in terrain that had been vacated only 4 days previously. Whatever Major Hoshino's plans were, they were not realized. About 40 of his men were killed and the rest dispersed. Behind them, Hull dispatched Colonel Howie's 1st and 2nd Battalions to clear the remaining enemy units west of the Driniumor River. Over 2 days of complex and sometimes uncoordinated company actions, the Americans successfully overran narrow stragglers in the area. Further south, as Japanese troops were seen crossing the Driniumor, at a fording point about 2,500 yards south of Afua, Cunningham sent Troop A south to some high grounds behind the Driniumor to halt the Japanese movements westwards. There, the 78th and 80th Regiments under Major General Miaki Sadahiko were assembling for a renewed offensive. Adashi's new plan involved Miaki striking Afua from the south while the 239th Regiment prepared to move against the Kawanakashima area. Additionally, the retreating 237th Regiment and the reserve 66th Regiment were ordered south to join future attacks by the 20th Division, though they wouldn't arrive until July the 25th. As Miaki force maneuvered into position to the right and rear of Cunningham's 1st Squadron, Starr struggled to close the gap in the center, which was eventually sealed off on the morning of July 18th. That night, Miaki launched an attack with 2 battalions of the 1st Squadron's command post and the adjacent perimeter held by Troop A, successfully pushing them 250 yards northeast. Early in the afternoon of July the 19th, fresh Japanese units began to surround the Troop A position, moving in from the north, northwest, west, and southwest. The 1st Squadron commander called for artillery fire to break up his enemy maneuver. Upon cessation of the fire, Troop A attacked to the south and west for the second time. Driving at least a company of Japanese before it, the troop pushed 600 yards southwest of its original positions astride the Afua-Palaru Trail, and temporarily disrupted enemy plans to seize the position. About 140 Japanese had been killed during the 2 days operation around Troop A. The South Force, at the same time, lost 8 men killed and 29 wounded, all from the 1st Squadron, 112th Cavalry. There were strong indications that more attacks might occur in the 1st Squadron area, but Troop A was not destined to take part in any of these actions, as they were replaced by the 21st by Troop C. Following this victory on July the 21st, Troop C relieved the battered Troop A. Howie's battalion successfully set up a patrol base at the east branch of the Coronel Creek, and Starr's 2nd Battalion moved to Palaru to provide additional outer security southwest of its airfield. On the 19th, the first elements of General Wing's 43rd Division began landing at Aitape, while the 2nd Battalion, 169th Regiment, subsequently took over about 1,000 yards of the river line on the right of the 124th Regiment by the 22nd. Meanwhile, Adachi ordered the still reorganizing Miaki force to attack Afua from the north and west, while General Nakai's 79th Regiment crossed the Driniumor River and attacked from the south. On the evening of the 21st, Miaki launched his attack on Troop C's position, successfully cutting it off from the rest of the South Force. While the cavalrymen resisted heavy Japanese attacks, Miyaki's units also repelled Cunningham's attempts to relieve the beleaguered troop over the next few days. Not knowing what other plans the Japanese might have in mind, General Cunningham was unwilling to pull any more troops away from the river defenses. Moreover, he now considered the position of his right flank to be untenable. He therefore withdrew Troop B north of the Afua about 1,000 yards and used the unit to form a new defensive line, which ran westwards about 500 yards from Troop A's right flank, anchored on the Driniumor River. South Force's right flank was now refused, and additional protection had been secured for medical, supply, and command post installations at a dropping ground banana patch. Troop C was left isolated behind Japanese lines, and Afua was again released to the enemy. It was not until the night of July the 21st that the Japanese forward units were able to organize for any sort of attack. During that night, elements of the 124th Infantry received considerable mortar, machine gun, and rifle fire from east of the Driniumor. This fire increased the next morning, and at about noon, the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry was attacked from the west by elements of the 237th Infantry. The first Japanese attack was, quote, finally broken up by a bayonet charge. This was conducted by elements of the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, but other attacks followed as troops of the 1st Battalion, 239th Infantry tried to move across the Driniumor River from the east. striking both the 124th Infantry's unit and part of the 2nd Battalion 169th Infantry. Before dark on the 22nd, the 3rd Battalion 124th Infantry counted 155 new dead Japanese in the area. That unit and the 2nd Battalion 169th Infantry reported their own losses as 5 killed and 25 wounded. The 1st Battalion 239th Regiment made further unsuccessful attempts to reopen the river crossing. By July the 25th, Attaché decided to send the 41st Division south to assist in the southern effort. After the fall of Afua, Hull ordered Howie's battalions to leave their East Branch base and reinforce Cunningham's South Force, arriving at the new line by July the 23rd. With these reinforcements, Cunningham decided early in the afternoon to send Troops A and B to attack west towards Troop C, while Howie's 2nd Battalion pushed southeast towards the isolated troop. Despite being uncoordinated, the infantry successfully moved into Troop C's perimeter from the northwest and helped repel a heavy Japanese attack from the southwest, while the cavalrymen reoccupied Afua and established new defensive positions. However, American attempts to break out on the 24th were unsuccessful due to the Japanese defending all tracks, trails, and ridgelines in heavily jungled ground northeast of the perimeter. On July the 25th, Howie's companies E and B unexpectedly established contact about 500 yards north of the besieged forces against light resistance, allowing the battered Troop C to finally withdraw. With Troop C relieved, Howie's units continued to attack south and west towards the Afua-Palaro Trail, successfully pushing the Japanese into the Torikeli Mountains. Many Japanese troops remained positioned in a triangular area, bounded by the dropping ground, Afua, and Company G's ridgeline position, where they continued to harass Cunningham's forces. Rifle fire, intensifying as darkness approached, harassed the rear and right flank of the two battalions. The Japanese began intermittently to drop light artillery or mortar shells into the Banana Patch area, where the command post of the South Force, the 112th Cavalry, and the 127th Infantry were now located. Finally, Japanese patrols coming from the west had scouted the Banana Patch area during the day, action which seemed to presage an enemy attack during the night. To get out of range of the enemy fire and danger of the enemy counterattack, General Cunningham moved the command post installations 500 yards to the north before dark. Additionally, the 127th Infantry patrols had found a Japanese map which indicated that the 66th Infantry, 51st Division, was concentrating in the Kwamiknirk area. Indeed, the 66th Infantry, which, with attached units, was at least 1,000 men strong, had crossed the Driniumor River at around the 24th of July. Bypassing the right flank of the South Force, the regiment had moved into the heavily jungled high ground west of the Banana Patch and dropping ground. In addition, the remnants of the 237th Infantry, probably about 300 men strong, had finally arrived in the Afua area on July the 25th and had passed to the control of the Miaki force. Rear elements of the 20th Division, including additional men from the 26th Field Artillery and Engineer units, had also crossed the Driniumor south of Afua. The number of Japanese troops in the South Force area by nightfall of the 26th of July was at least 2,500, but may have been over 3,000. On July the 27th, the battalion launched a successful southward attack, but ongoing Japanese movements to the west eventually necessitated an American withdrawal, despite other units under Cunningham managing to repel enemy advances. The following day, Cunningham consolidated his positions to bolster defenses in anticipation of potential large-scale Japanese assaults. However, on July the 29th, efforts by the 1st Squadron and the 2nd Battalion to attack south and west into the triangle were thwarted by determined Japanese defenders led by Attaché. As a result, only localized patrol actions were conducted on the 30th and 31st, as Cunningham devised plans for another offensive into the triangle. Major combat activity revolved around the withdrawal of Company G 127th Infantry from its exposed outpost west of Afua. On the afternoon of the 29th, the unit had been driven more than 400 yards east of its original position by Japanese attacks and had established new defensive high grounds about 300 yards west of Afua. On the 30th, the company was surrounded and spent all day fighting off a series of small-scale attacks. The next morning, it fought its way north to some dropping ground, where it arrived at about 1:30. Thence, it moved on to the Driniumor River and joined the rest of the 2nd Battalion 127th Infantry, which had just switched positions with the 3rd Battalion. During that period of the 13th to the 31st of July, South Force had suffered almost 1,000 casualties, of which 260 had been incurred by the 112th Cavalry. For the understrength cavalry regiment, this was a casualty rate of over 17%. The 2nd Battalion 127th Infantry had also lost heavily and was in need of rest, reorganization, and re-equipment, needs which had prompted General Cunningham to change the places of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. South Force casualties were as follows: 106 killed, 386 wounded, 18 missing, and 426 evacuated because of disease and sickness. South Force had estimated it had killed over 700 Japanese. By the end of July, with the arrival of most of the 41st Division, Adachi believed he was amassing enough reinforcements near Afwa to launch a final offensive. The 238th Regiment, the 41st Mountain Artillery, and the 8th Independent Engineers were across the river in time by the 30th, but the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 239th Regiment, had missed the crossing point on the Driniumor and they were lost. Fortunately for the 18th Army, the South Force withdrawals on the 29th and 30th gave the 20th and the 41st Divisions time to complete their organization. New orders were issued for the attack to start on August 1st, with the 20th Division on the west and the 41st Division on the east. The strength of that 20th Division could muster for the attack was a little over 2,000 men. Most of these troops had been without food for some time. They were suffering from starvation, malaria, and skin diseases. Morale was cracking. They were short of both ammunition and weapons. The 41st Division and its attached units, totaling nearly 1,750 men by the morning of August the 1st, were in equally bad shape. Nevertheless, General Adachi was determined to make one last attack with nearly 4,000 troops now available to him in the Afo area. Despite sensing minimal Japanese resistance to the north, Hull was eager to mount a robust counteroffensive against the 18th Army. The 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, which had been patrolling in the Palaru-Chinapelli area, were relieved from duty by the 1st Battalion, 169th Infantry, and on the 30th they joined the regiment at the Driniumor. The 2nd Battalion, 169th Infantry, were already at the river. Tactical control of the counteroffensive was vested into Colonel Edward Starr, commanding officer of the 124th Infantry, whose counterattack organization was to be known as the TED Force. The 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry, was commanded by Major Ralph D. Burns, the 2nd Battalion by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Fowler, the 3rd Battalion by Lieutenant Colonel George D. Williams, and the 2nd Battalion, 169th Infantry by Major Williams Lewis. To avoid confusion, the 4 battalions were referred to by the last names of their commanders rather than their number designations, I guess in the Japanese fashion. Fowler's battalion, attacking along the coast, was to be supplied by ration trains moving along the coastal trail from Animo. The rest of the TED force pushing through the trackless, dense jungle was to be supplied by airdrop. The 149th Field Artillery Battalion, augmented by a cannon company, 124th Infantry, were responsible for artillery support, but when necessary, the 129th Field Artillery was to add its fire to that of the 149th. All of the artillery units were emplaced on a beach west of the Driniumor's mouth. The positions which the 124th Infantry and the 2nd Battalion 169th Infantry left vacant on the Driniumor were to be occupied by the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 128th Infantry. Colonel Starr had succeeded General Stark as commander of the North Force on the 18th of July, when the arrival of elements of the 43rd Division at Aitepe made it necessary for General Stark, the assistant divisional commander, to move back to Blue Beach for administrative duties. General Stark apparently had resumed command of the western sector in place of General Hutchinson. He was the assistant divisional commander of 31st Division, who had just rejoined his division when less than the 124th Infantry moved to a new operational area in western New Guinea. When TED Force was organized, North Force had also apparently ceased to exist, and the 128th Infantry took over the defensive functions previously assigned to the North Force on the Driniumor River. The name for the TED Force originated from the diminutive for Colonel Starr's first name. There was always so many units from different divisions and regiments operating along the Driniumor that the task force usually found it more convenient to use names rather than numbers for their unit designations. The names, usually derived from the commanding officers, served not only to lessen confusion, but also did double duty as code names. The attack was to be carried out with 3 battalions abreast along a front of 3,000 yards, and the 4th in reserve and in position to protect the right flank of the advancing force. The 4 battalions were to move east to the line of Newman Creek, destroying all enemy found between the stream and the Driniumor River within a 3,000-yard wide zone of responsibility. Upon their arrival at Newman, the battalions were to reorganize and prepare for future advances along east or south, with orders coming from General Hall. All 3 battalions of the 124th Infantry began crossing the Driniumor on schedule at 8 a.m. on the 31st of July, moving into terrain concerning which only incomplete and sometimes inaccurate information was available. The 1st Battalion faced delays from enemy delaying actions, but eventually reached the creek by August 1st, while the remaining battalions advanced inland, also reaching Newman successfully. The 1st Battalion's advance company had been held up about 800 yards east of the Driniumor River by elements of the 1st Battalion, 239th Infantry, which had been left along the river when the rest of the Japanese regiment had moved south of Afua on July the 26th. Burns' men continued to encounter strong opposition from the 239th Infantry elements throughout the day, and did not break off contact until 5:30, when the battalion bivouacked for the night, still 800 yards west of Newman Creek. Company A had been separated during the day and remained some 550 yards northwest of the main body for the night. Both sections of the battalion were out of touch with the rest of the TED force. The 3rd Battalion 124th Infantry crossed the Driniumor at a point about 3,000 yards inland and reached the Newman about 2 p.m., having encountered only scattered rifle fire. Lewis's 2nd Battalion 169th Infantry, which had followed Williams' command, made no contact with the enemy and bivouacked for the night about 500 yards west of Williams. All battalions spent the day on August the 1st consolidating and patrolling along Newman's Creek, and Burns' unit moved up the line with the others. Meanwhile, Cunningham planned his own offensive aimed at dismantling the triangle position following a reconnaissance mission along the Afua-Palaru Trail. However, preliminary actions were disrupted when 2 companies launched a surprise attack from the southwest against Troop C's lines at 6:20 a.m. on August the 1st. General Cunningham immediately canceled the planned reconnaissance in force into the triangle area and turned his attention to this new threat. The 1st Japanese assault units were quickly reinforced and the enemy moved forward against Troop C in massed waves along a narrow front. A bloody battle ensued as the enemy, apparently determined to commit suicide, continued this mass attack. South Force called for artillery support, which was quickly forthcoming and which greatly helped Troop C throw back the enemy assaults. By 8 a.m., the Japanese had withdrawn from the battle area and became strangely quiet. Patrols were sent out with the cavalry perimeter to reconnoiter. These parties counted 180 dead Japanese in front of Troop C's lines, and it was considered probable that the enemy had carried off many more dead and wounded. Troop C, on the other hand, had lost 5 men killed and 6 wounded. Examination of the enemy dead disclosed the elements of both the 80th and 238th Infantry regiments who had participated in the attacks. 3 minutes later, Cunningham proceeded with his reconnaissance mission, encountering minimal resistance before returning in the afternoon. Despite capturing documents indicating an impending major assault, Cunningham deployed the 2nd Squadron as a mobile reserve at his command post. Although the movement of the 2nd Squadron had apparently been well advised, the Japanese did not attack the command post area. Instead, at 7 o'clock, elements of the 41st Division struck the 1st Battalion 127th Infantry at its line south of the dropping ground. This attack was preceded by fire from 70mm and 75mm artillery pieces, which the Japanese had managed to sneak into the area within 150 yards of Company B, 127th Infantry. Following a few rounds from this weapon, Japanese infantry charged forward in 4 separate waves, employing perhaps 300 men on a very narrow front. Few of the enemy got near Company B's positions, for the attack was thrown back with artillery, motor, and machine gun fire, which caused heavy losses amongst the enemy forces. By 10:30, action in the dropping ground area stopped for the night. During the early hours the next morning, on the 3rd of August, the 1st Battalion 127th Infantry again heard enemy activity in its front, and at about 7:30 a.m., a small Japanese party struck between Companies A and C. This attack was quickly repulsed, principally by motor fire from the 1st Battalion units. By noon, all activity in the 1st Battalion area had ceased, and the Japanese had withdrawn to the southwest. Concurrently, Cunningham's 1st Squadron faced attacks from Nakai's 20th Division, but their suicidal charges were also turned back by resilient defenders. The 1st Squadron 112th Cavalry, on the left rear of the 1st Battalion, was attacked by another group of Japanese at 7:45. This action was probably meant to have been coordinated with the attack on Company B, but if they were, the enemy's intention seems that something had gone wrong. Apparently there had been a lot of mix-up in unit dispositions, for both enemy efforts had entailed the use of elements of the 78th, 80th, and 238th Infantry regiments. After the day's action was finished, the combined effective strength of the first 2 units was probably no more than 250 men, and the 2nd Battalion, 238th Infantry, was practically wiped out. The desperate attacks during the day had been carried out with a complete disregard for self-preservation, and it probably cost the Japanese 300 men killed and at least twice that number wounded. TED Force was subsequently directed to advance south along Newman Creek towards Torikeli Mountains foothills to disrupt Adachi's supply lines and to flank the 18th Army. Supply challenges in dense jungle terrain initially delayed Starr's southern movement, with his northern battalions only linking up with the southern ones by the day's end. The next morning, Starr launched a southward offensive, immediately encountering fierce resistance from the 1st Battalion, 239th Regiment, which held a stubborn defense throughout the day. In response, Starr ordered his 1st Battalion to bypass the engagement and move southwest. Advancing unopposed for up to 1,000 yards, on August 3rd, proved relatively calm for Cunningham, as the 1st Battalion, 169th Regiment arrived to bolster the South Force perimeter. However, vigilance remained high in anticipation for Mano's impending final assault. On August 1st, General Miaki learned that the American forces were active in the Yakimal area. It was erroneously reported to him that this was an amphibious operation, a maneuver which the 18th Army commander had feared for some time. Actually, the report referred to the patrolling by the 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry along the coast from the mouth of the Newman Creek. He therefore ordered the remaining elements of the 237th Infantry to extricate themselves from the operations in the Afua area to hurry back to the Yakimal area to reinforce service units in the vicinity. Events moved so rapidly that the remnants of the 237th Infantry never got to Yakimal. Instead, the advance of Ted Force made it necessary for General Miaki to change his plans and accelerate a general withdrawal. Communications within forward units of the 18th Army had broken down so much that it was not until August 3rd that General Miaki learned that Ted Force movement across the Driniumor had occurred, although the 1st Battalion, 239th Infantry, had been in contact with Ted Force since July 31st. When General Miaki did hear of the American movement, he grossly underestimated the strength of the Ted Force. Thinking that the American operation was being carried out by just 400 troops, General Miaki merely changed the orders of the 237th Infantry and instructed that regiment to hold the 18th Army's crossing points at the upper Newman Creek. On that same day, on the 3rd of August, General Miaki issued detailed plans for the withdrawal of the 18th Army units to the east side of the Driniumor, a withdrawal which had to begin on August the 4th or 5th. The 66th Infantry 51st Division was to protect the 20th and the 41st Division units as they crossed the Driniumor. The continued advance of the Ted Force on August 3rd prompted General Miaki to change his plans. And early on the 4th, he ordered the 20th Division to start retreating at noon that day and the 41st Division to break contact on the 5th. The following morning, elements of the 238th and 239th Regiments emerged from the jungle southwest of the 1st Squadron in a final desperate charge. Violent action continued in the front of the 1st Squadron for about 2 hours, during which time nearly 200 Japanese were killed at the very edge of the squadron perimeter, principally by machine gun and rifle fire. How many more of the enemy were killed by artillery and mortar fire during that period cannot be estimated, but the banzai tactics undoubtedly cost the Japanese more than 200 deaths, counted in front of the 1st Squadron, which, in the same 2 hours, lost only 3 men killed and 4 wounded. By 9 a.m., the last enemy attacks had ceased and the remaining Japanese had withdrawn generally to the south. Following the enemy withdrawal, Troop E pursued the retreating Japanese southwards, encountering sporadic rifle fire as they eliminated remaining stragglers. The terrain encountered on August the 4th and subsequently, during the days of the operations of the Ted Force east of the Driniumor, proved next to impassable. Dense jungle undergrowth covered the ground and the area was thick with heavy rainforest. Low but knife-like ridges separated from each other by deep gullies were encountered, and swampy spots were plentiful. To add to the men's misery, rain fell during the day, a downpour which turned much of the ground into a quagmire and flooded many dry steam beds. A few rough trails recently cut by the Japanese were found, but mud made them nearly useless as routes of advance. Low clouds coming in from the Torikeli Mountains to the south prevented ration and ammunition drops and increased communication difficulties. Battalions ran low on drinking water, for weather conditions prevented resupply of water purification tablets, and the assault companies had neither time nor equipment to clean water by other means. Radio communication between battalions, from the battalions to the Ted Force headquarters, and from the latter to the higher echelons was nearly non-existent, for the heavy jungle and the damp weather cut down the efficiency of all radio equipment. It had been hoped that the advance on the 4th would carry Ted Force south to the main Japanese supply route, but the trail reached by Burns, Lewis, and Williams battalions was another route which had not been used by military traffic for some time. Possibly it was a section of a native trail to Afua, and as such, purposely avoided by the Japanese inasmuch as many parts of it could be seen from the air. In any case, the track cut on the 4th lay about 1,200 yards north of the east-west trail which most of the Japanese forces moved to and from the Afua area. Colonel Starr, realizing that the main Japanese supply route had not yet been severed, ordered his units to continue southward on the 5th, on which, that day, the advance was resumed at about 8 a.m., with Williams leading and Lewis's battalion about 400 yards to the rear. Pushing south along the new precipitous and mountainous banks of the upper Newman, Williams' unit was opposed by only scattered rifle fire at about 11 a.m., when it was decisively halted by a strong Japanese force conducting a stubborn defense. On August the 5th, learning that the TED force was approaching the point at which the 18th Army's main line of communications crossed the upper reaches of the Newman Creek, General Miaki had also ordered the 8th Independent Engineers to aid the remnants of the 237th Infantry in holding the crossing point. It was this combined 237th Infantry, 8th Engineers force that Williams' 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, had encountered at about 11 a.m. on August the 5th. The composite Japanese unit was dug in along a 1,000-foot-high ridge across Williams' line of advance, and threatened to outflank the battalion by occupying other high ground nearby. Despite artillery and motor support, Williams' men were unable to advance. Colonel Starr ordered Lewis's unit to bypass the fight and continue south to locate and cut the Japanese main supply route. Fighting at Williams' front continued through most of the afternoon, and Colonel Starr realized that the Japanese force could not be dislodged that day. Fowler's battalion was brought up to the rear of Williams, and late in the afternoon set up a new perimeter with a regimental command post. Before dark, Williams' men withdrew slightly from their most forward positions so that artillery concentrations could be placed along the front. Lewis's unit, which had moved off to the southeast to bypass Williams' fight, made little progress in very rough terrain and was cut off from the rest of the TED force before it could swing westward. Meanwhile, another battalion to the west encountered minimal resistance as it intercepted the main enemy trail east of the Driniumor, linking up with patrols from Cunningham's 2nd Squadron. Action on the 6th started earlier than TED force expected. At about 3 a.m., approximately 400 Japanese attacked Williams' perimeter. This enemy force comprised elements of the 41st Division, supported by men of the 26th Field Artillery and of the 20th Division, with some remnants of the 8th Independent Engineers. Attacking under the cover of fire from machine guns, mortars, and 75mm mountain guns, the Japanese force was attempting to secure fords over the upper reaches of the Newman Creek and to protect the withdrawal of other elements of the 18th Army units from Afua. Though surprised, Williams' men held back the initial onslaught. Reportedly, Japanese riflemen then climbed trees surrounding Williams' perimeter to pin down the American troops while other Japanese continued to attack on the ground. Fowler's unit, under orders to bypass Williams' fight and to move around the enemy left, started moving at about 8 a.m., but soon found the terrain made it impossible to avoid contact with the Japanese opposing Williams. The Japanese, having control of most commanding ground in the area, stopped Fowler's leading company. The action was not rapid. The terrain made all movement slow and laborious, and a lot of time had been taken to coordinate artillery support fire properly. Under the cover of artillery fire, another company of Fowler's battalion, creeping slowly through some ravines and almost up a vertical cliff, worked around an unoccupied high ground on the Japanese left. The rest of the battalion was unsuccessfully disengaged to secure more commanding terrain in the same area. The Japanese, finding themselves outflanked and subjected to increasing heavy artillery and motor fire, began to withdraw southwards in the mid-afternoon, relieving the pressure on Williams' front. Fowler's battalion, in enveloping the Japanese left, had moved north and then westward, and the maneuver had carried the unit by dark to a point just north of the main trail, roughly 750 yards east of Burns' battalion. Williams' men withdrew to reorganize after disengaging from the enemy forces late in the afternoon. At dark, having resumed the march westward, they secured high ground north of the trail. The ground covered during the day by Williams' battalion was little more than 500 yards west of his position that he had occupied the previous night. The unit probably could have moved farther, but Colonel Starr halted it so as to not increase the distance from Lewis's battalion, which was, in effect, quite lost. The unit had laboriously struggled over extremely rough and trackless ground during the day, fighting in the afternoon against a number of Japanese who had withdrawn from Williams' front. For the night, Lewis's men had set up a perimeter about 800 yards south-southeast of the scene of Williams' fighting. With Adachi's escape route blocked, Starr's battalions advanced southwards, achieving notable success by killing around 500 Japanese soldiers between August the 6th and the 7th. In the interim, Cunningham's South Force completed operations in the sector, achieving a successful attack led by Howe that ousted the remaining disorganized Japanese presence from Afua on August the 6th. 2 days later, the 124th Regiment advanced to the Driniumor, claiming to have eliminated approximately 1,800 Japanese soldiers since the start of their counteroffensive, at the cost of just 50 men killed and 80 wounded. With the rest of Adachi's 18th Army retreating towards Wewak, General Gill declared Afua secure by the evening of August the 9th. Following the conclusion of the Battle of the Dromore River, the fatigued units of the 32nd Division, including the 124th Regiment and the 112th Cavalry Regiment, were relieved by units from Wing's 43rd Division. From August the 16th to the 25th, Wings regiments conducted final combat missions in the Aitape region, encountering minimal Japanese resistance east of the Driniumor, except for some delaying actions near the mouth of the Driniumor River by patrols of the 103rd Regiment. Consequently, General Kruger declared Aitape's operation concluded on August 25th, confident that the 18th Army posed no further threat to the Tachi airstrips. Aitape's forces had indeed suffered a decisive and costly defeat, rendering them incapable of posing a significant threat to Allied forces anywhere in New Guinea. The campaign to secure the Aitape area and the defeat of the 18th Army resulted in approximately 440 Allied soldiers killed, 2,550 wounded, and 10 missing, while inflicting losses of around 8,821 Japanese killed and 98 captured, including 2,669 killed, 34 prisoners taken on August the 2nd to the 9th alone. Aitape himself would report the loss of 9,000 men and virtually the annihilation of 7 regiments. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I released a long-form documentary on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And as for podcasts, I'm actually releasing quite a few at the moment, but I do have a new ongoing series on the North African campaign of World War II. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. The last episode voted upon is about Unit 731, and I did not hold back. It is a gruesome episode, and to perhaps give some more information for those of you who are coming from this podcast, I also dabbled into the Operation Paperclip aspect of it. What exactly happened to many of the members of Unit 731 after the war was over? It's quite the cover-up story. So if that's interesting to you, why don't you go check it out? You can even get a free trial. The American forces under Hall and Cunningham repelled multiple fierce Japanese offensives, inflicting heavy casualties. Despite a lot of setbacks and logistical challenges, Ted Force advanced southwards, disrupting Japanese supply lines and forcing their withdrawal by early August. Casualties were significant on both sides, underscoring the fierce nature of fighting on Green Hell.